So anyway, from last time, I had discussed how kind of the Roman Empire formed when, we talked about how Julius Caesar got killed and Octavian, his grandnephew, took over. And he pretty much forms the Roman Empire. And of course, he's the one that, as you know, becomes known as Augustus, Emperor Augustus. You saw, of course, in that short little video about him. Of course, those are the dates for the Roman Empire traditionally. Usually it goes from 27 BC and it goes up to 476. You'll see that CE or AD, either one is written, which is fine. AD is just the Christian, either the Christian calendar, and CE just means common era. So we'll say Christian era also as well. So yeah, Augustus, like I said, became the first Roman emperor, which I think the dates for him are usually dated from 27 BC to about the year 14 CE or AD. There you see right there. Although I guess it starts early, really after he defeated, Antony and Cleopatra. He's pretty much reigning by 30 BC. So I think in a sense he was reigning 40 to 44 years. I think is usually the reign that he reigned over pretty much the beginning of the Roman Empire that we had. Hey, Gavin, good morning. We have a great morning up there. Glad you join us, of course, overall. So yeah, that's Emperor Augustus. I've got like different pictures of him, of course, you can take a look at right here. Of course, here's a slide on Augustus that we've got right here. There he is right there, of course, first Roman emperor overall. Now, Augustus, of course, a few things they had mentioned about, in the video, of course, the fact that they gave this title, if I remember correctly, Augustus. I think they say 27 BC is the date. And so that's why traditionally the Roman Empire starts at that date, because of the fact he was given that date, that title, which is all kinds of translations of it, like what Augustus actually means. Some people think it means exalted one, I think was what they said, or something like that. The venerable, or I think the great, is kind of like it's saying he's a great or majestic man. I think it's kind of what the translation of what it meant. And then, of course, he didn't really like the title. He thought it was too regal because really he's a monarch. That's what he basically becomes, more or less. So he had this other title that he preferred, which they said princeps, but I think the full name is actually princeps civitatis, which means first citizen. And he was trying to create this pretext that he was this head of state, not really a monarch. And so a lot of the emperors afterwards go by that title. They call them princeps. It's kind of where the word prince and princess comes from, I think, originally later that you have. And a lot of the emperors up to like before Emperor Diocletian comes in, they often call that period the so-called Principate, which I think goes from his reign to like 284, I think is the year. And so all the emperors kind of go by that title, but all the emperors are actually not called that by the Romans. They're called Caesars, if you know about that, or Caesar. You'll see it, in the Bible and all that. And then the word emperor is another word that they use too for them later, which the word emperor came from the term imperator, which was a Roman kind of a title that they gave to emperors actually generals that would win battles and things like that. They'd give them like a victory parade or triumph through Rome or whatever. So the term emperor was later used also as well. So hey, Tonica, what's going on this morning also as well. So yeah, it's kind of going into, where these titles, traditionally came from and all that about Augustus. Now, Augustus was seen basically, like they said, as the founder of the Roman, so he's like the father. He's kind of like George Washington to us, like founder of the United States. So that would be kind of like maybe kind of a comparison with that. You want to put it that way. But they usually call his reign the age of Augustus, which is a long reign, like 40-something years that he's in power. And it's a golden age. A lot of great things happen. Not only was the empire expanded, and it begins like a period of peace under the Roman state, but pretty much Augustus was the one that he kind of put on the screen here some things that he did that were well known. But He did reform the tax system. I know they talked about that in the video, but that was something he did do, and he hired a lot of civil service people, which I think were in the lower class, like plebes or things like. I think a lot of plebes. I know that in the civil service system and things like that. Built a network of roads throughout the empire. Built aqueducts to feed water, to cities. Pretty much established a main standing army at that time, also as well. Yeah, he did rebuild Rome. I think they talked about that whole thing about how he, when he came to Rome, wasn't much to it, right? He made it like more marble, expanded it. And the other thing he did that's very famous, he established what they call the Praetorian Guard. You've heard about them? The Praetorian Guard was the imperial bodyguards of the Roman emperors later. It protected the emperor's family in general. And the Praetorian Guard in the Roman army had a lot of power over the throne, like who would be, the actual emperor. And so when an emperor would die, a lot of times the military made the decision on who would become emperor, and not like the Roman Senate and really the main people and all that. So yeah, that's something that's different about how a lot of these rulers came into power, and it does create a lot of conflict later because most monarchs, the way it is later, would go to like the sun or something like that, but that's not how it worked really. Hey, Helena, what's going on? Having a great morning out there overall. Let me talk about also some of the different writers that wrote. Oh, there's one more thing I did want to mention about Augustus, which I almost forgot about. Pax Romana, which they were talking about also as well. What you see here, Pax Romana, you can see means Roman peace in Latin. And the era of Roman peace goes for like over 200 years, like 207 years or whatever it is, a little over 200-year period. And it was a period where Rome went through a period of prosperity. It's where the empire peaked in size, which was, I think, close to about 2 million square miles at one point. It was like a golden age period. It's like where you have some of your best Roman emperors that actually lived at that time. So, Augustus is probably one of the greatest. Maybe Marcus Aurelius, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian. Those are some of the great emperors that lived about that time. Hey, Nat, good morning also as well. Glad to join us also as well. So, yeah, I just kind of talking about that. So he did start the so-called Pax Romana. And really, it's the most peaceful period. It's most peaceful period, of course, for when, pretty much in history, not too many wars that are kind of going on. Nadia, I'm not sure what you mean by translations for the exams coming up. I'm not sure what you mean by translations. Let me know about what that means, of course, about the exams. But yeah, we are going to have a probably final, which will be in week 8, most likely. Not sure what you mean by translation. But anyway, so let me talk about also the different writers that write about, of course. You have the historians that write about, that time period. There's really the 3 big ones they had overall, which will be, of course, those are the 3 right there. Tacitus is considered to be, by the way, one of the greatest of really the Roman historians, probably at that time. He wrote, of course, numerous books for that time period that's well known. I think his main books that Tacitus wrote were really 3 or 4. Yeah, they're well known. Annals of Rome, of course, is one of the first, which kind of recorded some of the early history of the empire that's developing. Histories of Rome was written more into the later part of the 1st century. So he covers a lot of the early emperors in the 1st century that we have. Life of Agricola was another book he wrote, which told the story of the Roman general Agricola, who conquered like most of like Britain, especially in Scotland and all that. He was actually Tacitus's father-in-law. Then On Germania was another book he wrote, which was about Germany at the time, like back in ancient times. So he's probably the first to write about it overall. Then Suetonius was another author, famous Roman writer, the 12 Caesars. And he has a series of biographies that cover from Julius Caesar up to the Flavian dynasty, I think up to Emperor Domitian. So he gives a lot of the early information on a lot of the different emperors. His book is more complete. And I think Tacitus does have some books missing, I think, on some of the Roman emperors. I know like Tacitus doesn't have Caligula for some reason. It's missing more or less. But sometimes they think some like Suetonius is kind of more sensationalized, some of the emperors. Like they think that stuff about Caligula and Nero may have been exaggerated, things like that. And Cassius Dio, another author, of course, History of Rome, was an 80-volume set that most of that's still around, which is pretty good. He was writing, of course, much later, up to like the 2nd, 3rd century and all that. Hey, Devin, what's going on? Also, as well, Nadia, yeah, the Latin there was a third. That means with the English word like the pax. Oh yeah, I think it is Latin. I guess is what it usually should be. Is what it is. Yeah, pax means peace, and then the other one means Roman. So Roman peace, I guess. It's kind of backwards, the way they do in Latin overall. All right, let me go ahead and, of course, move on. I'm going to talk about, of course, more into some other stuff about now. Augustus died of natural cause. At least that's what they think, anyway. Which, of course, there's some speculation. It may have been poisoned, but they do have a dynasty, of course, that follows later, which is the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which I guess Augustus helped to found. And you can see it's got 5 emperors that are in it. And they're called the Julio-Claudian dynasty because of the fact that it's related to 2 families that kind of intermarried. One is the Julian family, which, of course, is related back to Julius Caesar and, of course, Octavian, Augustus. And then they have another family called the Claudian family that kind of intermarries also into the Julian family. And so that's why they actually call it that. But it's around for like close to, you can see, 27 BC up to 68 AD. So, yeah, it's around for about a century, roughly. And almost a century, like almost 100 years, you can see there. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. I think Tiberius was one of the main ones that was related back to the Claudian family. And some were kind of a mix of the two that are there. Hey, Natalie, what's going on this morning also as well? So you got all these emperors that of course, come in. And the one I'll talk about and kind of add a slide on him I've got, which is Tiberius. He, of course, was one of the first emperors that followed after Augustus died. He's one of the first of the so-called Caesars. That's what they start calling all these emperors later. And Tiberius was actually like his son-in-law. He married one of Augustus' daughters and became his adopted son. He was also a Roman general, is what he was, I think, gained fame for overall. And he would reign from 14 to 37 CE. Actually, was the second longest reigning ruler, like something like 23 years as emperor, Tiberius. And he had like been real famous for a lot of conquests, like in different parts of like mostly in Eastern Europe and part of Germany. So he kind of gained in fame at that time. And then over time, he was appointed as the emperor near Augustus' life and all that. But Tiberius is kind of a weird man. He was kind of very reclusive. In fact, over time, he became very tyrannical, reigning from this island called the Isle of Capri, which is off the coast of Naples. It's kind of funny because there's like in Louisiana, they got a casino that's called the Isle of Capri. You may have heard of that. I think it's kind of funny. But anyway, basically his prefects that controlled the Praetorian Guard, they ran the whole, like the capital of Rome, as he was like on his little estate on the Isle of Capri. These two prefects named Sejanus and Macro kind of ran it. And he was known for these so-called treason trials that he would put people on trial for, where they eliminate enemies of the state. Apparently Tiberius was kind of paranoid about being assassinated. And so he thought there were enemies everywhere. And so there was a period of political repression where he basically had people killed. They think that's maybe what caused Jesus, to be executed or something like that. Because Jesus was supposedly crucified, they think, in the later part of his reign. So he was a very paranoid man as well. And he was also perverted. I don't know if you know about that story, but there were stories that people talked about. Suetonius, I know, mentioned it, and all that, but he had these mass orgies where he had like different sexes, I know, in men and women, but for some reason he liked boys a lot, like young boys. He was into pedophilia and all that stuff. And so, yeah, that's kind of a weird story about him. But they think that's why Caligula ended up being all kind of weird after that, because Caligula lived with him and saw that stuff, So what happened was he was replaced by this other emperor that came in, which is Caligula. They think Tiberius, there's a debate about what happened to Tiberius. Some people think he died of old age, and then Caligula had him smothered to death because he came back alive or something. I don't know. There's kind of rumors about that, how he died actually. But Caligula, you can see here, came next into power. He basically was his nephew. His reign was marked by this kind of crazy things too, like insanity and a lot of debauchery also as well, which the only main historian that really gives a lot of information about him is Suetonius, mostly. For some reason, Tacitus it's missing the information. So we got to rely mostly on him for information about Caligula. But we do know about him. He actually was related somehow back to Augustus, like a great grandson of his. But he was actually the son of this famous general named Germanicus, who was kind of like an adopted, kind of a brother of Tiberius. I think Germanicus was supposed to be emperor, but he died prematurely at a very young age. But apparently his father influenced him. And there's a story about the fact that during his reign, I don't know if you know much about Caligula. He had a nickname. They called him either Little Boot or Little Boots. That was the name, which the caliga, I don't know if you know about this, the caliga is the Roman name of what they call the boot sandal that Roman soldiers wore. Apparently in his youth, he was dressed up like a little legionnaire. He became kind of like a little mascot, like under his father, Germanicus. And so people started calling him Little Boot, or Little Boots, something like that. And so that's the name that people called him over time. But they called him really Gaius, or sometimes they would call him Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus, or something like that. But he didn't really like I don't think he liked people calling him Little Boot or whatever. And but his reign was actually pretty good in the first 6 months. But what happened was he apparently went insane from some kind of illness and started killing off pretenders of the throne that were behind him. And it led to a lot of sadism, debauchery, and sexual perversions, like we talked about under Tiberius. He was also known for a lot of cruelty, like killing people and stuff like that, and exiled a lot of his relatives that he did not kill, and things like that. So yeah, there's all kinds of rumors about him too that were famous. That besides all the people he killed off or whatever, they think he may have had this love affair with his sister, Drusilla. Although they think he may have slept with all three of his sisters, actually, at one point. He also loved his horse. He had this horse named Incitatus that he had. It was a racehorse. And there was a story how he threatened to make his horse Roman consul, believe it or not. He also drained Rome's bank accounts. Apparently, Tiberius had a surplus, in the Roman treasury, and he came in and spent all the money within like 3 years. So he really was just probably shouldn't have been emperor. But people thought he would be a good emperor because I guess he was descended back to, going back to the Julians and all that. So, but he was later killed in some kind of conspiracy that happened in January 41 CE. Praetorian Guard, some elements of it that didn't like him, murdered him, killed him. And his uncle then took power afterwards, which was Emperor Claudius. So obviously Caligula was one of these emperors that you kind of want to forget about more than anything. So yeah, that brought in the next emperor, of course, which was Emperor Claudius. Supposedly when Caligula was murdered, some of the supporters of him that were in the Praetorian Guard that Claudius found him actually in the palace hiding. thinking that he was going to get murdered too as well. Because Praetorian Guard, I think those members, like they basically killed Caligula and his whole family. Like, they wiped him out, basically. So there's a famous painting they later made, I think in modern times, I know it is, that's well known today, where there's an image of him basically begging for his life as, the Praetorian Guard says, hey, you're now emperor now. So obviously it kind of shows you the power, the Praetorian Guard, the military. They're the ones that would often decide who the emperors, of course, would become. Claudius was the fourth Roman emperor. He reigned about 13 years, you can see. And I think a lot of historians think he was the second best one out of the Julio-Claudian emperors they had. I think it's Augustus and Claudius, and I don't know how you rank all the other ones. I think Tiberius is third, maybe, after that. Tiberius was actually a pretty good emperor, believe it or not, but he was just tyrannical and all that. But there's a few things that's famous about him. He's known for being one of the first emperors that's born outside of Italy, because most of them have been born before that there. But he was born in Gaul, which is what they call France, back in 10 BC. And so because of that, they supposedly gave like more citizenship to people because he was not born in Italy and all that. He was also famous for, here it is. He's also famous for conquering or beginning the conquest of Britain, 43 BC, which would take something like 4 decades for the Romans to conquer most of England and part of southern Britain, which is done later by Agricola, I told you later that Tacitus wrote about. So he was known for that, starting that. Other emperors had kind of invaded. I think Julius Caesar, I know, as a dictator, had invaded. I think Caligula invaded it too at one point, but not much happened with that overall. Part of why supposedly Claudius wasn't killed by Caligula was because he was kind of known for having some mental disabilities. He's also known for having a limp, like walking around with a limp. They called him sometimes Claudius the Lame or Claudius the Limp. I forget who it was that would talk about this sometimes, but Tacitus, I think, was the one that would say he had some kind of problem where he'd walk around and just fall down for no reason. So he had some kind of deformity in his face. So people thought he was just an idiot or something like that and stupid. But Claudius was known for having numerous wives. He had 4 different wives at one point that he married that he kind of went through. His fourth wife was very famous, Agrippina the Younger, or Agrippina Minor. She's important because she later conspired to probably kill Claudius via poison. I think he poisoned with poisonous mushrooms. And she was doing that to try to get her own son on the throne, who I think he adopted at one point, which is Nero. And so she's important, by the way. Agrippina was actually the daughter of Roman general Germanicus. So basically, she was the sister of Caligula that we're talking about here. And so she kind of maneuvered to get her own son on the throne, which is pretty much what she did with that. So that brought in, of course, the last of the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty, which, of course, is Emperor Nero that you've got, which is right here, of course, which may have been one of the most notorious up there emperors overall, maybe up there with Caligula as well. So Nero, came in next, 5th Roman emperor, of course, last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. You can see he reigned about 14 years, more or less. And he kind of blow up his, I don't know if he was that fat looking, whatever, but there's images, of course, of Nero with it look like a coin right there. And his reign is marked by a lot of different things. Tyranny, debauchery, religious persecution, like of the Christians, something he's kind of known for, which you may have heard about. Also known for matricide, if you know about this. He killed his own mother, Agrippina, had her put to death 59 CE, because apparently she was the power behind the throne, all that when he came in. Because I think when he came to power initially, Nero was only like 16 years old. So he was like really young at the time. And the thing that's, he was real popular with the lower classes. That's the weird thing about Nero, even though some of these authors like Suetonius and others kind of ridicule him and all that, but he seems to be actually popular, believe it or not. But the thing that he's, of course, well known for, if you've probably heard about this, is, of course, the so-called Great Fire of Rome. that supposedly occurred in 64 A.D. Here's some pictures of it in the map right there. That's something he's kind of blamed for later, even though he was kind of popular. I think it's more something maybe later he was blamed for. And according to Tacitus, it's like one of the main historians that really writes about the Great Fire of Rome. The Great Fire of Rome lasted close to almost 1 week, or over 1 week, believe it or not, destroying about 10 of about 14 districts of the old Roman city, at least destroyed or damaged it, more or less. Of course, historians are divided about the cause. Like some of the historians said that Nero was behind it. Some people think it was an accident. So back then, it was kind of debated about between, who was behind it. They do know it started on July 18th, the night of July 18th, 64 A.D. Started near the Circus Maximus, where they think it started. It spread to the rest of the city. It destroyed close to something like 60,000 buildings at one point. They don't know how many people were killed. I kind of looked that up, and I can't seem to find any information about that. But it did kind of, it did create a lot of refugees, obviously, from that, and they had to rebuild the city after and you can see the extent of the fire right there. Those are the areas that it mostly. So the starting point kind of looks like close to the Circus Maximus, east of it, looks like it right there. And you can see it burned out certain parts of it right there, east of the Tiber River. And of course, Nero got blamed for it. Some of even during his time, they criticized him for being behind it. And of course, the whole joke was that Nero sang the Sack of Troy and played, the lyre as Rome burned. If you know about Nero, he thought he was a great artist and musician. He kind of did poetry and things like that. But he got blamed for it. And so he kind of used the Christian community, which, Christians were starting to rise up as a new kind of religious sect in the Roman Empire. And so he blamed them for the actual fire, like for starting it, spreading the fire. And so he began this persecution of Christians during his reign, which he was one of the first emperors to actually do that, more or less. And so a lot of writers, like I think Tacitus and Nero were the main historical writers that kind of mention about how Nero persecuted the Christians. I know a lot of them were crucified. There were stories where they tell how Nero would have lavish parties, and he would crucify them and light them on fire for like a nighttime or something like that. Then, of course, they suppose were thrown to wild animals like lions and wild dogs to be torn to pieces, things like that. So they think that's the same time period too, when they think St. Peter, I think, and maybe Paul were martyred, like in early Christianity, were killed around that time, the 60s A.D. Overall. Now, they do eventually think that Nero, that's one of maybe the downfalls of that and his tyranny that kind of eventually went to it. And his military kind of basically rebelled against him, is what happened. It led to like a civil war, 68 to 69 AD or CE. The so-called year of the four emperors, I think they sometimes called it in Roman history. And the Senate at one point basically declared Nero like a pretty much like an outlaw, and he killed himself, committed suicide, believe it or not. And so that ended the whole julio-claudian dynasty with this death. And later, I'll get to it later, but his generals start fighting over it, is what happens. All right, then you've got, of course, the other thing I want to talk about today, which is well known. You've got the beginning of Christianity that kind of starts under really at the time of the first century, like going back to Augustus and Tiberius. You've got that occurring that time. So you've got Christianity beginning mostly in the Middle East, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where now Israel is today, and maybe Lebanon. So those areas are kind of where it kind of started. And as you know, the beginnings of Christianity were started by Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, who they think lived sometime in the early first century. He's considered, of course, one of the founders of Christianity, or at least based on the life and teachings and death of his ministry of Jesus, who they think was some kind of Jewish rabbi, I think is the term they now use today for Jesus, who lived in Galilee, which was like a northern part of Israel, where he lived in some kind of village, which is Nazareth at the time. And a lot of Christians later think that Jesus was, the Messiah, the Son of God, that's mentioned, of course, in the Old Testament, and all of that. And Christianity over time becomes, one of the largest religions in the world, which will evolve from the first century up, through the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages. So it's one of the three Abrahamic religions up there with, other ones, obviously Judaism and Islam as well. Most of it's based off of the books of the New Testament, but obviously they were influenced also by the Old Testament as well. The books of the New Testament are not compiled till later. So it's not till like the early 4th century. But a lot of the life of Jesus is based on the so-called gospel accounts y'all have heard of, which are Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John, which tell of his early life, the virgin birth under, Mary, and of course her husband Joseph, like at Bethlehem and all that. But a lot of his early life is kind of missing, about that between like when he's born and when he's adulthood, when he starts his ministry, like around his baptism usually, because there's not much information between that about him. They do think he was in his early 30s when he died, when he's crucified, Jesus, which there's different dates on when his ministry was. It's somewhere anywhere between 30 to 36, 33, I think, CE, sometimes a popular date of maybe when his crucifixion happened. They don't really know. They do know it happened under Emperor Tiberius' reign, but that's kind of debated about when it was and all that. And what they do know is that Jesus was arrested by Jewish authorities. He was accused of blasphemy for being the Father, basically the Son of God. And he was eventually turned over to the Roman authorities. It kind of went back and forth between the Jewish and Roman authorities. And eventually he was put to death under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. They do think Pilate was a real person, as far as we know, because he's mentioned by so many different authors that's outside the New Testament. I think Flavius Josephus, is one of the big writers that writes a lot about Pontius Pilate, who they think was in power, I think, as prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 CE or AD. So they do think he was a real person, as far as they know. Christians believe that Jesus rose, what we now call, Easter Sunday. And then from there, his disciples began to spread Christianity, throughout the empire. They do have this thing called the Great Commission, supposedly where Jesus, in his resurrected form or whatever, told his, all the apostles and his disciples to spread the message of Christ, to, the rest of the Roman world, which is mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. And so that happened, they say, in the year 33, but it's kind of debated about when it was. But it does start a period in early Christianity that's usually referred to, they call it the Apostolic Age, I think is the common name that they usually called it overall. Yeah, the Apostolic Age, which the dates of it vary, but I think predominantly 33, if that's the year when Jesus was crucified, it would go up to like 100 CE, because that's, I think, when St. John the Baptist died, about 100. So they think that's when the last apostle died, likely. But that's a period where all of his disciples began to spread the message of Jesus throughout the Roman world. So all the way to Spain and North Africa, as far away as eventually into Northern Europe and so on. And the apostles of Jesus, there was a lot of ones that were famous, that were well known. I'll kind of mention a few of them. Of course, they had the original 12 apostles of Jesus that they had, which, the original 12 were Peter, John, James the Greater, James the Lesser, Matthew, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Simon, Thomas, Thaddeus, Judas Iscariot, of course, you may have heard of, who portrayed Jesus, of course, at the Last Supper, as you know. And the ones, I guess, that are the most famous, I'll list up here, but Peter, of course, known as sometimes Simon Peter, or also St. Peter, of course, is really considered the most famous of the original 12 apostles of Jesus, often called the Rock. And he was later seen as the first bishop of Rome, or first pope, according to the Catholic Church. So Peter's pretty important. John, of course, the apostle, also called St. John, very, very important figure as an apostle early on. They think a lot of the books in the New Testament, like the Gospel of John, Epistles of John, Book of Revelation, are sometimes attributed back to, they think, St. John, the apostle. James, also known as St. James, son of Zebedee, of course. That's James, I believe, the Greater we're talking about. He's pretty important. I think if you live in Spain or whatever, he's pretty important. They think he helped spread Christianity to Spain. That's something he's kind of known for. Now, Paul of Tarsus, don't forget about him. He's very important, Paul is really the one that ends up being the more famous apostle over time. He didn't really know Jesus personally, but he's famous for spreading Christianity to those that are like Gentiles, or we call them non-Jewish Christians. He thought the religion could be spread to other people outside the Jewish faith, because that's where it started originally, like in the Middle East. And he also helped to found churches, like in, I think, Syria and part of Turkey, if you know about this. He had citizenship, so he could travel all throughout the Mediterranean world and spread Christianity. He's originally called Saul of Tarsus. He persecuted the Christians early on, but eventually converted. Maybe known as Paul, of course. He's known for his epistles, Pauline or Paul's epistles, that are well known, which are some of the early books also that are added to the New Testament after the gospel accounts as well. But like I said, the New Testament was not compiled until Constantine the Great's reign, like close to maybe 330 or 331 CE, I think it is the date. They'll even decide what gospel accounts go into them, because they do think there were many gospels that were kind of circulating about Jesus and his life. And the word gospel means, by the way, in Greek, good news. They do think it was written in Greek, of course, later, the gospel accounts, all that. What happened to Christianity? Well, it split over time. It didn't really stay together like, Christianity, how it is now today. It's kind of split up, And, but yeah, they broke up into different groups. The Jewish Christians, which were the original ones, had two groups that were kind of famous. The Nazarenes, which were related back to Jesus and his followers. They had another group called the Ebionites that broke away. The poor ones, I think they were called in Greek. This was one that was like a group that was kind of a sect of early Christians that believed that they lived like a more impoverished life, that would lead to salvation and things like that. And so a lot of the early Christians were more just Jews. And then over time, what happened was you had those that were Gentiles or non-Jews would break away, and they would form like a separate, form of Christianity, which Paul helped to kind of, develop, as you know. That became the main religion later. It became more of a Roman version. That's what happened, and the Jewish one kind of went away. And why did they split? There's all kinds of theories about that. What caused them to split? The Jewish-Roman wars had a lot to do with it. If you know about early Christianity, was connected to the temple, like Temple of Jerusalem, like in Israel. But what happened was it was destroyed during the Jewish-Roman wars. The Romans wiped it out. It's ironic that Jews became Christians and believed in Jesus because they hated the Jews. You know about it. They killed a lot of Jews in those so-called Jewish-Roman wars. Maybe 500,000, maybe the most, possibly. And also, Judaism and Christianity split ideologically was another reason why it occurred. And then also, there was this Jewish tax that was put on the Jews by the Flavian dynasty. And a lot of people didn't want to be Jews because you would get taxed. And so that's why the Christians want to be known as a separate religion and all that. But that opened them up to being persecuted, of course, later. So basically, you'd have this deal where the Jews would have a synagogue, right, based around a rabbi, and then Christians have a church based around priests, which is more of a Roman influence overall. Hey, Adrian, what's going on this morning? Also as well. So yeah, it's kind of talking about that. And one more thing about also the Christian church would split up. Over time, it's going to, like, especially by the Middle Age, you're going to have these two churches that are going to separate from each other. But you've got the Roman Catholic Church, ruled by like a pope. We have later in medieval times, in Rome. In the Eastern Orthodox or Orthodox Church, we based in Constantinople, they have a patriarch who's the religious leader of that. The tribe. And so you get these two that kind of split apart, and they were created out of the remnants of the Roman Empire. Because you have two states that kind of break away: Eastern Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire. And they get these two churches that kind of survive from it, basically. All right, let me move on. I want to next talk about and here's a map showing you the spread of Christianity. You can see these are the areas that it kind of went into over time. And you can see it started more in the eastern part and spread east to west, all the way to Spain. And it took a while to get into the northern parts of the Roman Empire, like France and Britain probably are more difficult. But you can see all the areas that it spread into, pretty much North Africa, Turkey, Syria, Greece, Italy, Spain, and then up into France and Britain. So you can see how it spread over time, a long time ago. Let me move on to talk about the Flavian dynasty as well, of course, which is here. The Flavian dynasty was another dynasty that came in. It's the second imperial dynasty of the Roman Empire. It's not around very long. It's only around for a few decades. You can see, I think it's not even 30 years, which you can see it had only 3 emperors too, which is Flavius, Vespasian, and he had 2 sons, of course, which were Titus and Domitian. It's very interesting. I'll get to that later, but it's the first case where you have an actual son that succeeds his father as emperor, like twice in a row, Titus and Domitian. I think I've got images showing basically the emperor's right here, the left to the right there. So you got on the left Vespasian, span that right there. But on the middle part, you have Titus, and on the right, you've got Domitian right there. And I'll talk a little about Vespasian first, a little bit about him. He was, of course, the first two, the left and on the right, Titus, they were both Roman generals that fought back under, going back to Nero's time and all that. And Vespasian was mostly this general that was famous for fighting in the first Jewish-Roman war, which was fought from 66 to 73 CE. And what happened was in what is Israel, which was actually made up of 2 areas, which is Galilee and Judea, the Jews all revolted because they didn't want to be under Roman rule anymore. They wanted kind of an independent state like they had before. And so they revolted. And it was like one of 3 major Jewish-Roman wars that were fought between the 1st and the 2nd centuries AD. And they were pretty bloody. Forget the number of Jews that died in all 3 of those wars, but some people think it may have been almost up to 400,000 to 500,000 that were wiped out. And most of the history of these wars were told by Josephus, who wrote a series of books on that period on the Jewish war. He also had these series of books he had called the Jewish Antiquities, which was kind of a chronicalized history of the Jewish people, going back to, I guess, the beginning. And he was he was really Jewish, but he became a supporter of the Flavian dynasty because he befriended Vespasian, believe it or not. And a lot of Jews thought he was a traitor, Josephus. But later, the Jewish-Roman wars creates the so-called Jewish diaspora, where all the Jews are spread throughout the world. That's why they all end up throughout Europe and other parts of North Africa, and also in in Babylonia and things like that, Mesopotamia. So they're kind of spread all over the world because of this, of course, occurring. So you got that also. The other thing that Vespasian did, which is well known, Vespasian is the one that founded, as you know, he built most of the Roman Colosseum. You see behind me also, of course, next to me on that's a little other picture right there. That was constructed, they believe, in 72 to 80 CE. They do think that this particular stadium or Colosseum was built mostly off of Jewish slave labor. Yes, it was. And it was originally known as the Amphitheater in Flavium. It was basically a type of, kind of like a Greek theater, but with two halves that were put together as one. So it became like a stadium like we have today. And so, yeah, the Colosseum is kind of like considered to be like the prototype to, the like football, soccer stadiums that we have today, where people play a lot of sports and things like that. And so it was built for mass entertainment, where they think it could hold up to 60,000 people, where we could watch different events during the day, which primarily was used for gladiatorial events, where they'd have swordsmen that would come in and fight sometimes to the death. But other spectacles were very real popular. Like they'd have wild beast hunts where they'd bring in exotic animals from all over, the empire, and they'd kill them in the stadium, and all that. They also had like other things where they have like mock naval battles. There was a story where they supposedly flooded the whole stadium with water. They fought mock naval battles called a Naumachia or something like that. They called it. But they would execute people. They put people in there to be eaten by lions or whatever. They'd put on plays, and if they had a part in the play where somebody died, they died, basically. Now they think that the stadium was used, the Colosseum was used for something like 5 centuries, and I estimated that somewhere between 400,000 to 500,000 people may have died in the stadium at one point, which seems like a lot of people, but it's really not. If you divide up, 500 years divided by 500,000 at the most, it's about 1,000 a year. So you might have like 2 or 3 people die a day, maybe in it, which isn't that many, but still, that's a lot of people, that eventually were killed in it. And it was infamous for probably a lot of Christians being probably put to death in it. I know for sure. But Vespasian eventually died, and he was replaced by his son came in and replaced him, which I've got a picture of him, which is Titus. I got his coin on the right there. You can see as well. So Titus came in next and became emperor. Vespasian died of old age. He was 69, almost 70 years old when he died. And Titus was more known for his military exploits. In fact, Titus was the other general that fought under Vespasian in the Jewish-Roman War. And I don't know if you know about it, he's notorious for sacking the city of Jerusalem during the war in the year 70 CE. They usually give him credit for destroying the second temple of Jerusalem. He wiped it out, except maybe for the Wailing Wall that's still there now today. And so he's one that did that. He also built the Arch of Titus, which is well known in Rome, which depicts a lot of the Jews on it, being basically their people being sacked and killed. So that's what he did. And Titus, I believe, came in. The stadium behind me, the Colosseum, was not quite finished. He actually finished it and opened it afterwards in commemoration of his father, I think right after. So he's not known for too much like during his reign. He had a very short reign. He only reigned I think it's like, I want to say a little over 2 years that he was in fact 23 or 24 months that Titus reigned at one point. And he's known for more like catastrophes that occurred under his reign. They had the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79. And they had another fire of Rome that also struck the city in 80. So a lot of bad things happened like under his reign as a whole. That's something I did want to talk about that's real famous that happened during this time. I mean, you probably heard about. That, of course, is the famous eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Erupted, of course, they think in August. It happened in August of 79, the year 79 AD or CE, in the western part of Italy, near Naples. And Mount Vesuvius is a very famous volcano in Italy, which has erupted multiple times. In fact, the last time it erupted, which you're looking at right there, was in World War II. when the Allies were fighting the Axis powers, like Germany, in Italy, like Hitler. And supposedly it obliterated several cities that were nearby, like Pompeii, Herculaneum, of course, were the most famous. They were buried by it, and they think somewhere like 16,000 people were killed due to the volcanic eruption. Close to, I think there may have been 20,000 people living in that area, and so about 16,000 got killed. And they say that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was 100,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is in World War II, to give you an idea of it. Also, the hydrogen bomb, to give you an idea, is 5,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. so you know, that shows you how powerful this volcanic eruption was. It literally buried these cities in pyroclastic surges and ashfall. So people were just buried in it. They couldn't escape. They either died from the heat or suffocated or got burned to death. And one thing that's very famous about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius is it was actually one of the first volcanic eruptions to be chronicled. Like somebody wrote about it, believe it or not, which was Pliny the Younger, who was a famous Roman lawyer at the time, who was later a writer, and he was known for writing a lot of letters to people, which are still around today. And apparently wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus telling him about how he and his, I think it was his uncle, they were kind of in the actual fire. I think Pliny the Elder, who was an uncle or father of his, and he died in it. And he told him the story about what happened in the eruption and all the people that died. And so that's something that's kind of famous about that. Also, Pompeii is well known for being like this buried time capsule that was later found in the 1800s. Archaeologists began discovering parts of the ruins of it that had been buried. You can see here some of the ruins of Pompeii with the volcano in the background right there. And so it became like a time capsule. Some of the buildings were actually in streets were pretty much in good condition that they discovered. And here's the actual Pompeii, their amphitheater that they had in the city. But they actually discovered in some sites at Pompeii and Herculaneum some human remains that were still there. And I think they took plaster of Paris and they actually formed the bodies about where they were originally that died. They did find skeletal remains, which is kind of rare at that time because the Romans were kind of known for cremating their dead and all that. So it's one of the most famous things that happened under his reign. And they had also another fire in Rome. They had in 80 CE, which burned a lot of buildings again, like before. And Rome had to be rebuilt later, especially under his brother Domitian. They think Titus died of some kind of illness. And so what happened was his brother came in next and took over, which is Emperor Domitian, who you see right here in this picture. And Domitian reigned the longest out of the Flavian rulers. He reigned about 15 years as emperor, but he was not a very popular emperor. He was basically one of these authoritarian type emperors. It was kind of like a dictator, and he was at odds with the Senate. He didn't get along with the Roman Senate at all. That's something you start to see with some of these emperors later that you had. And there was a big cult of personality behind him. He thought he was some kind of like a god or something like that, or living god that was on the throne. But it is under his reign that you do have they continue the expansion of the empire. I think the most famous thing that happened under him was that the Roman Britain was like most was conquered under Agricola that we talked about before. But he was like real ruthless. Like he cracked down on a lot of the senatorial class, had a lot of them put to death. There's even like some stories that he may have persecuted the Christians, which some of that's, I think, kind of exaggerated about it. But evidently his being at odds with the Senate eventually led to his assassination. And so in September 96 AD, he was murdered, which some of his servants were actually involved in it. They stabbed him to death. Domitian. So that basically ended the Flavian dynasty at that point. I do got a few minutes left. I did want to just for a while talk about also a few minutes on the so-called period of the 5 good emperors, which I'll kind of start on that today. And of course, I'll wrap up on that, of course, on Friday later in the week. But you do have, right after the Flavian dynasty collapses, you get this dynasty of emperors that comes in later, which is called the so-called period of the 5 good emperors, or really they call it the so-called Nerva-Antonine dynasty that enters as the new emperors afterwards. But the period of the 5 good emperors is a period basically from 96 to 180. And the term 5 good emperors was coined by Machiavelli. I don't even heard of him. He's a famous Italian writer and diplomat who lived around the 16th century in Italy. He wrote a book you may have heard of called The Prince, but he remarked that that during this time period there were 5 good emperors that reigned, like in a row, and so the term kind of stuck, afterwards. And so you get this deal where there's like a peak period where the Pax Romana is at its best, from that time period, with 117 CE, I think, being the peak of the Pax Romana, maybe in the Roman Empire, especially in size. I think 2 million square miles, I think it's, like I said, how big the Roman Empire got at one point. And they call it Nerva-Antonine. I'll get to it later because there's these different dynasty of rulers. There's actually 2 dynasties, one called Nerva, there's one called Antonine. They kind of combine it together as two dynasties as one. And I've got pictures showing all the different emperors that were part of it at one point. Emperor Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, which I think he might be one of the most famous that's there, of course, in the list. And they sometimes were called the adoptive emperors because I'll get to it later, but Nerva starts this tradition of adopting an heir to replace him as the next emperor. And so they were called that often. It happened like several times, of course. And so they called that too sometimes, the so-called adoptive emperors that they have. Here's an actual list of them, though. So you got the 5 I just mentioned, of course, right there, 1 through 5. They actually have 2 other emperors that reigned during that same time period. You've got Lucius Verus, who was kind of like this adopted brother of Marcus Aurelius, who kind of co-ruled with them. And then also, don't forget, Commodus was also there. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius. He was like one of the bad emperors. Of course, later they got, he's kind of part of that same period as well. But you got like the Nervas that you got first, which the Nervas basically are the first 3 you see there. So Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian is clear like the Nerva emperors. And Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, Lucius Verus, and Commodus are considered what they call the Antonine emperors that follow, of course, later. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about, a little bit about him. Nerva, the first one right there, he wasn't really known for too much. He was originally a Roman senator. He was actually an advisor to Domitian, believe it or not. When Domitian was assassinated, the Roman Senate actually appointed him as emperor, which is something you don't have happen very often, in Roman history, where an emperor gets appointed. Usually the military does that. And he reigned only for a short time, around 2 years or so. He wasn't known really for too much, except for some reforms you can see there, right there with land and taxation. But apparently the Roman army wasn't too happy about Nerva being, emperor, because he didn't have any military experience. And so they made him adopt basically a successor, which this became Emperor Trajan that came in, which his full name is Marcus Trajan. He will reign from 98 to 117, around 19 years. A lot of people think he was one of the greatest of the 5 good emperors. He's up there with, probably Marcus Aurelius as being a pretty good emperor. Him and Hadrian were pretty good. And Trajan was more known for his military conquests. He, of course, got the nickname by the Roman Senate. They called him Optimus Princeps, which means best ruler. and primarily he was known for his conquests, mostly in the East, like Eastern Europe. He also conquered parts of the Middle East as well. And it's under his reign that the empire really peaks in size. You can see here, here's a map of the Roman Empire, 117 CE. Areas that he conquered that's well known today, which I can put on the screen for you right here, but he conquered parts of Romania, which back then they called it Dacia, which was like a kingdom that was in that eastern part of Europe. Romania, Hungary, kind of in that area, Transylvania is kind of where it was. He conquered that area, included it in the Roman Empire. Mesopotamia and Armenia, he conquered that from the Parthian Empire. They say that he conquered part of the Crimea, which is up here at the top. Suppose they say he did that too, maybe. And then down here where Jordan is, he conquered this area, Jordan and Israel. That area right here was also added. Lastly, I think he went into the Arabian Peninsula, may have conquered over here too a little bit as well shortly. So those are all areas that he was known for conquering. He's also known for his famous forum called Trajan's Forum that he built, of course, in Rome. A lot of these great emperors would kind of extend the forum or add their own forum, more or less. And so it included like a series of he had like the Trajan's Baths that's very famous today at Rome. The ruins of it. Trajan's Markets are still there. Trajan's Column, which you can see there, is in the middle. Here's a better picture of Trajan's Column, which is right here again, which looks over the city. And so Trajan was probably one of the first great, emperor, of the five good emperors that you have. I'll talk about later some of the others. Of course, Emperor Hadrian's going to follow. Antoninus Pius, you'll have him. We'll also talk about Marcus Aurelius. Those are the peak emperors of the Pax Romana at the end. Then I'll talk later, about the end of the Roman Empire. We're going to get more into the later part of the Roman Empire, of course, on Friday this week, because we'll have a part 4 hopefully my main last lecture, of course, on the Roman Empire, which we'll have as well. So I know it's a lot of lecture on the day about the Roman Empire, but I covered like pretty much the first, second century, pretty much the peak part of the Roman Empire. But I'll finish up later, on the Roman Empire, of course, later in the week. So doesn't look like we have any questions about if you have an administrative question about the class, email me about that. But yeah, if you have any comments, questions about the lectures themselves, just leave me comments, questions, of course, on my YouTube channel about that.